So in this video we are going to begin discussion of unemployment, which is our second of the three major macroeconomic variables. So we've got output, unemployment, and price level. So first off, we just want to define, unemployment. What does it mean to be unemployed? And the simple definition is that a person who is unemployed is A, not currently working for pay, but B, they are actively seeking work for pay. All right, so pretty simple definition, but it's going to make a big difference when we consider different groups of people. And so when we calculate that number at the end of the day, we've got to be very clear about how we define this variable in particular. Now, we might wonder, well, why are we concerned with unemployment? Well, from the economic perspective, unemployed people are not being productive, right? Their skills, their labor is not being used, which means our economy is not producing as much as we might be able to. An unemployed person is not going to be earning income, which means they're not going to be spending money. And when people are unable to spend, it starts to slow economic activity down. So there's some, big concerns from an economist perspective that we have with unemployment. But there's also an ethical side to this, and we care about other people in our society. We want people to be able to take care of themselves, and obviously it's going to be very difficult for people to provide for themselves and their families if they are unemployed and they are unable to earn income to not only buy the things that they want, but to just to provide for their basic needs. So we have a strong justification, both economic and ethical, for identifying unemployed people and tracking that number, and then considering what could we do about this situation that people find themselves in. So that being said, definition of unemployment: people who are not currently working for pay but actively seeking work for pay. The question then becomes, well, how do we identify these people and then measure that unemployment rate? So to begin our measurement, to begin our calculation, we are going to start with the entire population of a society. All right, so in the United States, that's well over 300 million people. But there's two groups of people right off the bat that we are going to exclude from further calculations or from future consideration. The first group is the military. Right, active members of the military, kind of a special class of people. Right, they're working. Right, it's just they're doing a very special type of work. So we're going to count up all the active service members, and we're going to subtract them from the population. All right, and then the second group of people are all of those who are institutionalized. And this could include people that have committed a crime and are incarcerated. They're in jail or prison. It could include people who are institutionalized for mental health reasons. Either they may pose a threat to themselves or they may threaten to harm others. And it also is going to include people who are institutionalized in things like nursing homes. So these are people who, not necessarily mentally ill, but physical frailty, disability, illness requires that they be institutionalized somewhere where they can be provided with constant care. So all of those institutionalized persons are going to be subtracted out as well. So once we subtract the military, we subtract the institutionalized population, what's left over is what we refer to as the civilian non-institutionalized population. So civilian meaning not military, and non-institutionalized meaning non-institutionalized. So I like to call that CivPop. So I'm going to upload a little worksheet that kind of shows you how we go through these calculations for the practice problems. So we take population minus military minus institutionalized. That gives us the CivPop, the civilian population. Now, that civilian non-institutionalized population is going to be divided into two groups of people. One group of people are going to be those that we consider in the labor force, right? And then the other group will be not in the labor force. That labor force is then going to be further subdivided into two categories of people. So to be considered part of the labor force, you must be either employed, which means you are working for pay, or you must be unemployed, which again means you're not currently working for pay, but you are actively seeking work for pay. So the labor force is all the people that are actively supplying their labor or are attempting to supply their labor to the labor market. And so that's our labor force. Now, everybody else is going to fall into that second group, the people that are not in the labor force. So again, we've already accounted for the military, already accounted for the institutionalized. We've accounted for the people who are working and the people who are trying to work. So who does that leave for that not in the labor force group? Well, the most obvious responses would be, the young and the old. So people that are too young to be working. And when we calculate this, the cutoff is 16 years of age. So anybody 16 years or younger, we're going to consider them not in the labor force. But then we also, we're not going to account for people, or we will account for people that are old and retired. So people that maybe were in the labor force, and then they worked for many years, they retired, and so they left the labor force and are now living, in retirement. So those are the two most obvious groups. But there's lots of other groups of people that may not be working for whatever reason. So a lot of you guys are full-time students. You are not currently working, and neither are you actively seeking work for pay. So, high school students, college students, graduate students, if you are a full-time student and you are not working, we would consider you just simply not in the labor force. Stay-at-home moms and dads, right? So we know in a lot of families, they have someone that makes enough money to provide for the family, which allows them the luxury of having someone else stay home to take care of the kids. So, for example, my mom worked as a teacher. When my brother and I came along, she left the labor force, became a stay-at-home mom for several years, and then when we went to school, she went back to school and went back into teaching. So she left the labor force and then re-entered the labor force at a later date. Some people are just independently wealthy, right? They don't need to work, and so they sit around, enjoying life, or maybe they spend their time volunteering, right? They simply don't need to supply their labor to gain access to funds to support themselves. So independently wealthy people, or people who win the lottery. Other groups that we might not consider, many disabled individuals are not part of the labor force. Now this has changed over the past couple of decades with things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, where employers are required to make certain accommodations. But for a long time, if you had severe mental or physical disability, you just weren't going to be out there working or trying to find a job. So certain individuals are still not in the labor force. My dad has a bad back, and so he's no longer able to work in a typical setting, so he's not in the labor force. Who else? Homeless individuals, right? Not actively working or seeking work. Let's see, am I missing anybody? Oh, the last big one, which we'll come back to in the second part of this lecture. Discouraged workers. So a discouraged worker is typically someone who may have had a job, so they were employed. They lost that job, so they became unemployed. But again, if you're unemployed, you're actively seeking work, so you're still part of the labor force. But in some cases, especially during particularly bad recession, such as we just saw in 2007 to 2009, a large number of, or just any number of unemployed workers may become discouraged. In other words, they are unemployed for so long that they get discouraged and they just give up looking. Well, remember that to be unemployed, you have to be actively seeking work for pay. If you were no longer actively seeking work for pay, then you are no longer unemployed. And if you're no longer unemployed and you're not employed, then that means you are not part of the labor force. So a discouraged worker is someone that removes themselves from the labor force due to typically strong or big economic changes. All right, so these are all the groups of people, and pretty much every person in the country is going to fall into one of these groups of people. Right? We start with the population. We got the military, the institutionalized. We set them aside for now. That leaves us the civilian, non-institutionalized population. We divide those groups of people into people who are in the labor force or not in the labor force, and then we take that labor force and we divide it into employed and unemployed. And so again, refer to the worksheet that I'm going to post to see how this breaks down. I'm going to summarize this with both just some equations to say that these people plus these people equals this larger group of people, and I'm also going to create a little kind of tree chart that will help you kind of visualize this breakdown. Now, the last thing we're going to do is once we've classified everybody based on their current employment status or lack of employment status, is we're going to do two basic calculations. The first is going to be what we call the labor force participation rate. And so we're going to take two numbers that we've just hopefully calculated. We're going to count the number of people in the labor force, and then we're going to take the number of people who are in the civilian non-institutionalized population. And all we're going to do is take that labor force, divide it by the civilian population. That gives us a ratio. And then we multiply it by 100 to give us a percentage. All right, so this will tell us that of all the people that are in the civilian population, how many of them are currently participating by either actively working for pay or actively seeking work for pay. And so for a country like the United States, it typically hovers around 70%, and that number will rise and fall. So for example, during the recession in 2007, 2009, we saw labor force participation actually decrease. And a big part of that was because a lot of people that lost jobs during the recession eventually became discouraged workers, right? So they removed themselves from the labor force. So we saw it dip. A lot of people, like myself, it was actually after the recession, but I went back to school, right? A lot of people, when they lost their jobs during the recession, went back to school. So we saw labor force participation decline a little bit. We can look at this variable, labor force participation, and in more detail. We can break it down by gender, and we can look at the difference in participation between men and women. Historically, men have participated at higher rates than women, but especially since World War II in America, we've seen a steady increase in the participation of women as they have entered the labor force at increasing numbers. We can break this down, based on geography, look at participation rate in different parts of the country. We can break it down by race or ethnicity, or we can break it down by education to see, how many high school graduates are participating or how many college graduates. So there's a lot of different ways that we can, think about who is participating in the labor force. Now, the final calculation is the unemployment rate itself. And so it's another simple calculation. We need to know two numbers. We need to know, first off, the number of people who are currently unemployed. And again, that means they are not working for pay, but they're actively seeking work for pay. And then we also need to know that labor force. And so all we do is we take the number of unemployed people, we divide it by the labor force, that gives us a ratio. We multiply that ratio by 100, and that gives us a percentage. And so, for example, currently in the United States, the unemployment rate is about 4.9 or 5%. As we mentioned in our discussion of the business cycle, during the Great Recession, we saw unemployment hit 10%. So obviously, when the economy shrinks, unemployment goes up. And as the economy has slowly recovered, we've seen the unemployment rate fall. And again, we can look at unemployment rate by state, by other geography, by race, gender, ethnicity, education. Again, we can slice and dice it in a lot of different ways. So that's the basics of unemployment, what unemployment is and how do we get to that unemployment rate? How do we classify all of the people in the society? So in the next discussion, we'll talk a little bit more detail about, how do we collect that data? What groups might we not necessarily account for in that unemployment rate? And then we'll discuss types of unemployment. And then finally, we'll come back to this concept of full employment, and we'll refine it just a little bit.